If you love stories about quiet strength, hidden heroes, and justice finally served, hit subscribe before we begin, because this one is going to give you chills. Emily Carter had been a nurse at Riverside General Hospital for exactly 3 weeks when the whispers started. It wasn't her competence they questioned. She moved through the trauma bay with a calm precision that even the senior staff couldn't ignore. It was her arms. Thin, silvery lines crisscrossed her forearms, disappearing beneath the sleeves of her scrubs. A map of something none of them understood and none of them bothered to ask about. Probably some kind of self-harm thing. Nurse Danielle Ross muttered to a colleague one afternoon, just loud enough for Emily to hear as she walked past the nurse's station. You'd think she'd wear long sleeves, at least have some self-respect. Emily said nothing. She never did. She simply adjusted her badge, picked up her tablet, and moved to her next patient. It wasn't the first time someone had judged her by what they could see instead of asking about what they couldn't. She had learned, a long time ago, that explanations were wasted on people who had already decided who you were. Dr. Marcus Webb, the head of the ER, wasn't cruel, but he wasn't kind either. He simply watched her with a skeptical eye. The way a man watches a new hire he suspects won't last the season. "Carter," he said one night during a particularly brutal shift, "keep up or step aside. This isn't the place for people with baggage." She kept up. In fact, she did more than keep up. When a car crash brought in 3 critical patients at once, it was Emily who triaged them in under 60 seconds, correctly identifying the one with an unseen internal bleed that would have killed him, within the hour if left for the doctors to catch on their own. When an elderly man went into cardiac arrest in the hallway, it was Emily who started compressions before anyone else had even processed what was happening. Her hands steady, her voice calm, calling out vitals like she'd done it 1,000 times before. Because she had. None of them knew that. None of them knew that before Riverside General. Before the crisp blue scrubs and the mocking whispers. Emily Carter had spent 4 years as a combat medic attached to a special operations unit, deployed to some of the most dangerous stretches of Earth most people would never see on a map. None of them knew that the scars on her arms weren't from some private struggle, whispered about in break rooms. They were shrapnel wounds from an IED that had torn through a convoy in the mountains. Wounds she'd earned while dragging 2 wounded soldiers to cover under enemy fire, refusing to leave them behind even as her own blood soaked through her uniform. She never talked about it. Not because she was ashamed, but because the men she'd served beside had asked her not to, and some things were meant to stay in the unit, sealed away like classified files, protected not by law but by an unspoken code of brothers and sisters, who had seen too much together to explain it to people who hadn't. The mockery continued in small, cutting ways. Someone left a bottle of long-sleeve compression sleeves on her locker with a sticky note that said, "Just a suggestion." Danielle made comments about attention-seeking, scars within earshot during lunch. Dr. Webb assigned her the least desirable shifts, seemingly testing how long she'd last before she broke or quit. Emily absorbed it all with the same stillness she'd learned in combat. You don't waste energy on fights that don't matter when there are lives on the line that do. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, everything changed. An ambulance call came in. A training accident at a nearby military reserve base. A young soldier down, severe trauma, incoming in 4 minutes. The trauma base sprang into its usual controlled chaos. Doctors and nurses pulling on gloves, prepping equipment, bracing for whatever came through those doors. What came through those doors wasn't just a patient. It was a full detachment of Navy SEALs. Boots pounding against the tile floor, faces set in grim, focused lines, flanking a gurney carrying their wounded teammate. Blood soaked through a hastily applied field dressing on his thigh. And one of them was shouting vitals with the clipped, practiced urgency of men who had done this before, in far worse places than a hospital hallway. Dr. Webb froze for half a second too long, overwhelmed by the sudden intensity of the room. It was Emily who stepped forward first, her voice cutting through the noise, with an authority none of her coworkers had ever heard from her before. Femoral bleed, pressures dropping. I need O negative now, and get me a rapid infuser. She didn't wait for permission. Her hands moved with the exact same precision they had in the mountains years before, packing the wound, calling out numbers, working in perfect sync with a team that had no idea she'd been trained for exactly this moment her entire adult life. The soldiers around the gurney exchanged glances, and then one of them, the broad-shouldered senior chief with graying stubble and eyes that had clearly seen things, stopped mid-motion and stared at her arms as she worked. at the unmistakable pattern of scarring that told a story he recognized instantly. "Carter," he said, disbelief cracking his voice. "Emily Carter?" She glanced up for just a second, startled, and then recognition flooded her face. "Chief Alvarez." The room went quiet in a way trauma bays rarely do. Every nurse, every doctor, every onlooker froze as the pieces began clicking into place, watching their new colleague, the one they'd mocked, dismissed, and questioned for 3 long weeks, snap back into a rhythm of triage and command that clearly wasn't new to her at all. Once the patient was stabilized and wheeled off to surgery, Chief Alvarez didn't leave. He turned to face Emily fully, and in front of the entire stunned staff of Riverside General, he raised his hand to his brow in a slow, deliberate, formal salute. "Staff Sergeant Carter saved my life in Kandahar," he said, his voice carrying through the silent trauma bay like a verdict. "Pulled me and 2 other guys out from under fire after our vehicle got hit. Carried me 200 yards on a blown-out knee. Patched me up under a ridge while taking rounds from a position 30 yards out. I owe this woman everything." He paused, eyes sweeping across the stunned faces of the nurses and doctors, who had spent weeks quietly tearing her down. Every scar on her arms is a story about someone she saved. "I'd be very careful who I let judge her." Danielle Ross's face went white. Dr. Webb, the man who had questioned whether she belonged there at all, simply stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, searching for words that wouldn't come. Emily didn't gloat. She didn't even smile, not really, just a small, tired nod toward Alvarez, the kind of acknowledgement shared between people who had survived something together and didn't need more words than that. Then she turned back to her tablet, back to her next patient, because that was who she was. Not someone seeking recognition, not someone needing an apology, just someone who showed up every single day and did the work, whether anyone respected her for it or not. In the weeks that followed, the whispers stopped. The sideways glances turned into quiet nods of respect. Danielle never apologized outright, but she started deferring to Emily during codes, started actually listening when she spoke. Dr. Webb, to his credit, pulled her aside privately and admitted he'd misjudged her, that he was grateful to have her on his team, but Emily didn't need the apology to feel whole. She had never needed their approval to know her own worth. The scars on her arms had always told the truth, even when no one around her was willing to look closely enough to read it. It took one salute, one moment of recognition from someone who truly understood sacrifice, to remind an entire hospital that the quietest people in the room are often carrying the heaviest, most extraordinary stories, and that judging a person by their scars will always say more about you than it ever will about them. If this story moved you, don't scroll away just yet. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story of hidden heroes and quiet justice. Drop a comment below telling us what you'd have done in that trauma bay, and hit that notification bell so you're the first to know when the next one drops. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next story.